Right now, we are witnessing a moment that many thought would never actually come. Federal marshals have officially begun the grim task of identifying and seizing the very properties that built the legend of Donald Trump. It wasn't just a loss in court. The judge in charge of this historic case didn't merely disagree with Trump's defense, she completely and systematically tore his legal strategy to pieces in a ruling so incredibly sharp that even the most seasoned legal observers are calling it a landmark of judicial brutality against a former head of state. This financial nightmare was set in motion when Trump's own legal team filed a series of desperate emergency motions arguing that taking his assets was a violation of the Constitution, that the fraud ruling was nothing more than a political hit job, and that forcing him to hand over the keys would inflict a fatal blow to his global business network. But the judge was having none of it. She dismissed these claims as utterly frivolous, lacking any foundation in the law, and described them as a direct insult to the court's own integrity. If you want to stay informed on how these massive legal battles are reshaping our country's future, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell right now. This isn't a simple story about a wealthy real estate developer losing a few buildings. What we are watching is the methodical, block-by-block dismantling of the Trump Organization's most prized possessions. These are the structures that have defined the New York City skyline and served as the backbone of Trump's personal brand for half a century, and now they are being itemized, valued, and handed over to satisfy a staggering civil fraud judgment. Make no mistake, when you see federal authorities literally putting padlocks on the doors of Trump Tower or moving trucks parked in front of 40 Wall Street, the abstract idea of legal accountability suddenly becomes a very physical, undeniable reality. It is almost surreal to watch an empire that took 5 decades to build, an empire used as a primary exhibit for Trump's self-proclaimed business brilliance, begin to fall apart simply because he could not stop exaggerating the true value of his holdings. To understand how we got to this point of no return, we have to look back at the massive civil fraud litigation launched by New York Attorney General Letitia James. For a long time, James led a deep dive investigation into claims that Trump had been running a dual-track accounting system, inflating property values to astronomical heights when he wanted to secure favorable loans and insurance deals, but then magically shrinking those same values when it was time to pay the taxman. These weren't just small errors or rounding mistakes. The investigation revealed that Trump had claimed his personal penthouse was nearly 3 times larger than its actual square footage, valued his Mar-a-Lago estate at upwards of $500 million when its real-world value was just a tiny fraction of that, and generally treated property appraisals like a game of make-believe across his entire portfolio. When the case finally reached a courtroom in late 2023, Judge Engoron concluded that Trump had engaged in a persistent, decades-long pattern of intentional fraud. By February 2024, the court handed down a judgment exceeding $450 million when you factor in the interest, while also ordering the return of any profits gained through these deceptive practices. Naturally, Trump's team filed for an appeal immediately, but this is where he hit a massive wall of reality. In the state of New York, if you want to stop the government from collecting on a judgment while you're appealing, you have to put up a bond that covers the total amount plus interest. For Trump, that meant he needed to produce nearly $500 million in liquid cash or high-value assets just to keep the seizure process at bay. Reporting from outlets like Politico in March 2024 highlighted the gravity of the situation. Trump's attorneys admitted they had reached out to more than 30 different bond companies, and not a single one was willing to back a bond of that size, using Trump's real estate as collateral. The reason was simple and deeply ironic. Trump's own fraud trial had proven that his property valuations were completely unreliable, and no legitimate financial institution was willing to gamble $500 million on his word. Let's be honest for a second. You don't see asset seizures happening to former presidents, and you certainly don't see them happening to billionaires who actually possess the wealth they claim to have. These kinds of enforcement actions are reserved for the moment someone has run out of legal maneuvers, when a court has definitively ruled they owe a massive debt and they simply don't have the means or the will to pay up. The fact that we are standing here watching this unfold tells you everything you need to know about the actual state of Trump's finances compared to the golden image he has spent a lifetime polishing. According to a variety of reports from CNN and CBS News, the process of taking control of these assets shifted into high gear this week. New York State attorneys, supported by federal marshals and court-appointed receivers, began arriving at Trump-owned locations with court orders in hand. At 40 Wall Street, a legendary Manhattan skyscraper that Trump has always called a crown jewel, officials were seen entering to start the inventory process and set up new control protocols. At Seven Springs, his massive estate in Westchester, court-hired appraisers were given access to walk the grounds and perform formal valuations. Even the iconic Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, the very symbol of his 1980s-era success, saw legal teams entering its gilded halls to figure out how the property could be sold or transferred to satisfy the state's judgment. Trump's lawyers tried every trick in the book to freeze these actions. They submitted urgent motions claiming that seizing these buildings would cause irreparable harm, not just to Trump personally, but to the thousands of tenants, small businesses, and employees who work within them. They tried to frame the entire ordeal as a political vendetta, arguing that Letitia James had campaigned on a promise to get Trump and was now using the legal system to settle a score. They even went as far as saying that taking his property before the appeals process was totally finished was a violation of his constitutional right to due process. According to NBC News, his legal team tried to paint a picture of total economic chaos, warning that these forced sales would tank property values and hurt innocent bystanders in an unconstitutional government taking. However, the judge was completely unmoved. In a written decision released this week, one that legal experts are calling a total demolition, Judge Engoron addressed every single one of those arguments and crushed them. Legal analysts like Jeffrey Toobin noted that the language used by the judge was remarkably blunt. She pointed out that Trump had been found liable for fraud after a very long trial where he had every chance to defend himself. She made it clear that this judgment wasn't some unexpected ambush. It was the direct and predictable result of behavior that the court had already labeled as persistent, egregious, and highly calculated. Regarding the claim of irreparable harm, the judge was particularly sharp, noting that any damage being done was entirely self-inflicted. If Trump wanted to save his assets, he should have either avoided committing fraud in the first place or simply paid the bond required by law. The fact that he couldn't find a bond company to trust him wasn't the court's problem to solve. The ruling became even more personal when it addressed the political motivation defense. The judge wrote that Trump's attempt to paint the entire New York legal system, from the Attorney General to the courts themselves, as part of a giant conspiracy was not only backed by zero evidence, but was a slap in the face to the integrity of the judiciary. She reminded everyone that Trump had been granted every possible procedural protection and that the evidence of his fraud was simply undeniable. Pretending this was about politics instead of the law was, in her view, just another bad faith argument from a legal team that had become famous for them. As MSNBC's legal experts put it, the judge basically accused Trump of trying to hijack the appeals process, using it not to find justice, but as a tool for endless delay. This is a massive story that changes by the hour, so if you're finding this deep dive useful, please hit that like button and share this video so more people can understand the legal reality behind the headlines. Of course, this is a movie we've seen before. Trump has a long documented history of trying to delay, deny, and deflect whenever he is backed into a legal corner. This strategy of fighting every inch, claiming victimhood, and ignoring court authority has been the hallmark of his recent years. Look at the classified documents case down in Florida. For months, he insisted the records belonged to him, claimed he could declassify them with his thoughts alone, and told the National Archives they had no right to them. He ignored subpoenas and fought court orders until the FBI was forced to show up with a search warrant. Even then, he called it a witch hunt, only changing his tune to "everyone does it" once the threat of actual prison time became a reality. The same thing happened with the January 6th investigations. He claimed executive privilege applied to him even as a private citizen. He sued to stop the National Archives from helping Congress. He told his inner circle to ignore subpoenas. When the criminal charges finally arrived, he argued that as a former president, he was basically immune from the law for anything he did while in the White House. The playbook is always identical: slow the process down, file an appeal, claim the system is rigged, and hope the clock runs out before you have to face the music. We saw it in the E. Jean Carroll cases as well. Even after a jury found him liable and told him to pay millions, he went right back to social media to attack her again, leading to a second lawsuit and an even bigger judgment. He fought the bond requirement there too, calling it unfair and politically biased. This behavior actually predates his time in politics. Long before he was a candidate, Trump was known for this exact routine in his business dealings. He would hire contractors for his massive projects, wait for them to finish the work, and then either offer them a tiny fraction of what they were owed or refuse to pay altogether. If they sued him, he would unleash a swarm of lawyers to drag the case out for years, bankrupting small companies with legal fees until they just gave up. The goal was to make it more expensive to fight him than to just take the loss. But now, he isn't fighting a small construction company. He's up against government prosecutors with nearly infinite resources. He's finding out that you can't bully the state into submission the way you can a local contractor. So, why are legal experts so stunned by this specific ruling? According to those who have read the full opinion, the judge's destruction of Trump's defense happened in 3 key phases. First, she took on the irreparable harm claim. Trump's lawyers said that selling these buildings now would cause damage that couldn't be fixed, even if he won his appeal later. The judge countered that the bond requirement exists for this exact reason. It's a balance. If he really thought his appeal was a winner, he could have protected his properties with a bond. The fact that he couldn't get one wasn't a sign of an unfair system. It was a sign that the professional risk assessors at bond companies didn't think his assets were worth the risk or that his appeal had any chance of succeeding. Then she pointed out the ultimate irony. Trump was in this mess because he lied about how valuable his buildings were to banks, and now he was begging the court to believe those same buildings were so precious that they couldn't be touched, yet no bank would accept them as collateral at his suggested price. The judge basically said the market had spoken and the market agreed he was a fraud. Second, she dismantled his due process complaints. His team said enforcing the judgment during an appeal was unconstitutional. The judge reminded them that New York's laws are specifically built to protect the process. The bond ensures that if a defendant loses their appeal, the money is actually there to pay the victim. Without it, someone could sell off all their assets while the appeal is pending and leave the winner with nothing. She noted that this system has been upheld by courts for years and that Trump was getting the exact same treatment as any other citizen, nothing better, but certainly nothing worse. Thirdly, she went after the political persecution narrative. The judge wrote that Trump's constant claims of being a victim were becoming tiresome and were beneath the dignity of a court of law. She emphasized that the Attorney General's case was built on hard evidence, that Trump had a full trial with his own lawyers, and that the verdict was based on facts, not feelings. She warned that his rhetoric wasn't just incorrect, it was an attempt to destroy public trust in the entire American legal system, and she felt the court had a duty to reject those claims as forcefully as possible. This leaves Trump's legal team in a nightmare scenario. On one hand, they are trying to appeal the original fraud ruling, but that process is moving forward while his actual properties are being taken away. Every single day that passes without a bond is a day where more liens are filed and more buildings are prepped for sale. On the other hand, their options for stopping it have evaporated. They can't find a bond company, and Trump clearly doesn't have the $500 million in cash he's spent years telling the world he had. They've gone to the higher courts for emergency help and been rejected. They've asked for stays and been denied. At the end of the day, when the legal arguments run out, you're left with a very simple truth. A court says you owe money, and if you don't pay, they take your stuff. That isn't a conspiracy, it's how the law works for everyone else. Many people are calling this a watershed moment. Andrew Weissman, the former FBI general counsel, noted on MSNBC that this is the exact point where Trump's carefully crafted persona as a billionaire genius is finally colliding with the wall of legal reality. For decades, he used his worth to get deals and power. Now, the court has found that much of that foundation was built on lies, and the fact that no bank will help him is the market's way of saying, "We know." It's an unmasking of his entire identity. Former prosecutor Ellie Honig added that the judge's tone was particularly telling. Usually, judges try to sound very neutral, especially with famous defendants. But for a judge to call a defendant's arguments bad faith and insulting shows a level of frustration that is very rare. It shows the court no longer sees Trump as a serious litigant, but as someone just trying to manipulate the system. Even voices like Jonathan Turley, who often defends Trump on Fox News, admitted this ruling was on solid legal ground. While he might agree with the political optics being messy, he acknowledged that New York's bond rules are long-standing and applied to everyone. Trump was asking for a special exception because of who he is, and the courts were right to say no. What do you think about the judge's ruling? Was it fair or too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. I read all of them. Now let's look at what this means for the rule of law in America. The fallout of this will be massive. First, there's the direct financial blow. If iconic buildings like 40 Wall Street or parts of Trump Tower are sold off, it doesn't just cost Trump money, it kills the brand he spent 50 years creating. Then there's the Cascade Effect. Most of these buildings have huge debts attached to them. If the marquee properties are seized, the banks holding the loans on his other buildings might panic and demand their money back immediately, which could lead to the total collapse of the entire Trump organization. Politically, this is also a disaster. He ran on being a winner and a deal maker. Watching the government take his buildings because he can't even get a loan proves the exact opposite. It's not just a political attack, it's the market calling him a failure. His opponents will use these images of federal marshals at his door to tell voters that his whole career was smoke and mirrors. The MAGA world is currently in a state of civil war over how to react. One side, led by Steve Bannon, wants total war. Bannon has actually called for supporters to surround Trump Tower and physically stop the seizures. On the other side, some Republican strategists are quietly terrified that this reveals Trump is actually broke, which damages the party's brand. A third group is trying to complain about the unfairness while wishing Trump had just settled the case years ago. Trump himself is on Truth Social in all caps, attacking the judge and the AG, trying to convince his followers that if they can do this to him, they can do it to anyone. But the facts remain. He committed fraud, he lost, and he can't pay. Ultimately, this is about more than just one man. It's about whether the American legal system actually works. If someone can lie about their wealth for decades to get ahead and then avoid the consequences by being famous and loud, then the rules don't exist. This case is sending a message that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. If you can't get a bond because no one believes you're honest, that's not a witch hunt. That's your reputation catching up with you. As we move closer to the 2026 elections, the image of Trump Tower changing hands is going to be a visual that no amount of spin can erase. The stakes for the rule of law have truly never been higher than they are right now.